What if God isn't a being? What if God is the living relationship of existence itself? Lately, I keep returning to a strange experience I had during meditation. Sometimes when I sit quietly in meditation, I don't experience God as something separate from life or separate from me. I don't experience God as a distant being watching existence unfold. Instead, I experience something that feels more like existence itself, aware, unfolding, and in relationship with itself through everything that is happening. And I don't say this as certainty, only as a question I am learning to stay with while exploring other ways that other individuals describe how they experience this too. Before going any further, I want to be clear. This is not a claim that all experiences are harmless and that all actions are excused. Suffering and harm are real, and they matter deeply. Any perspective that reduces accountability and bypasses the reality of harm misses something essential. What follows is an exploration of relationship, not an escape from ethical responsibility, but a way of staying more in contact with it. What if God is not separate from existence? What if the sacred is not outside life, observing it or judging it? What if the sacred is life itself, appearing, dissolving, forming, and reforming in endless relationship, not as a static thing, but as a living process, a continuous unfolding of being and knowing? In this view, nothing would be excluded from the sacred, not clarity or confusion, not joy or grief, not expansion or contraction, not creation or destruction. All of it would belong in the same field of existence, not because everything feels the same, not because everything is acceptable, but because everything is a part of the same movement of reality expressing itself. Sacred in this sense does not mean excusing harm. It means nothing is outside of relationship, including what must be repaired. What if consciousness is relationship? Sometimes I notice that what I experience as awareness does not feel isolated inside myself. It feels deeply relational. There is the sensing of a body, the movement of thought, the presence of emotion, the perception of the world, the experience of other people, the constant interplay between all of these things. What if consciousness is not a thing located inside an individual? What if it is the relational field in which experience arises and is known? What if knowing is not something we do to reality, but something reality is doing through relationship? What if the mind is a part of sacred unfolding? We are often taught that thinking pulls us away from the truth and that the mind is something to transcend. But I find myself questioning whether thinking might actually be a part of the same unfolding process. Psychology suggests that meaning making is not optional for human beings. We interpret, organize, and reflect in order to live. We make sense of what happens to us, often in real time, often imperfectly. What if this is not a mistake of consciousness? What if questioning, analyzing, and reflection are also ways life comes to know itself through us? Not always accurate, not always peaceful, but still part of the same relational field. What if neuroscience is showing us a relational being? Neuroscience does not describe a self existing in isolation. It describes a nervous system shaped through interaction, attachment, safety, rupture, and repair. All influence how we experience reality. Even what we call healing often involves restoration of connection between body and awareness, between past and present, between emotion and understanding, between self and others. What if what we call healing is not becoming someone different, but restoring relationship where connection has been disrupted? What if nothing needs to be excluded to be sacred? One of the most difficult assumptions in many spiritual teachings is the idea that certain experiences must be transcended in order to reach higher states. But I find myself asking different questions. What if nothing needs to be excluded in order to belong? What if fear is not outside of the sacred? What if grief is not outside of the sacred? What if confusion, anger, doubt, and not knowing are not failures of consciousness, but forms of consciousness itself in motion? This does not mean everything feels the same, and it does not mean everything should be excused or justified. Suffering and harm are absolutely real and they matter, and I believe we should be working towards creating a world where there is less suffering. However, from this perspective, the presence of the sacred in all experiences does not remove responsibility. I believe it deepens it. Because if everything is part of a relationship, then we are always participating in how that relationship unfolds. That raises questions of accountability, repair, and the ways we respond to harm. How do we take responsibility without collapsing into shame? How do we address harm without creating more harm in the process? How do we hold truth and compassion at the same time as holding others accountable? What if the work is not to transcend difficult realities, but to engage them in ways that reduce fragmentation, increase repair, and move towards creating less harm? Any interpretation of a view that minimizes harm, avoids accountability, or bypasses repair would miss this central intention, that we need to be in relationship with one another and ourselves in a way that creates understanding and accountability. What if God is the process of knowing? I don't pretend to know what God is, but I find myself drawn to a possibility that feels closer to experience than explanation. So I find myself asking, what if God is the living process of existence knowing itself through relationship? Not separate from life, not above life, not outside of life, but the intimate unfolding of life, experiencing, sensing, and reflecting itself through all forms of existence. In that sense, nothing would be outside of God, because nothing would be outside of existence. This is an invitation, not a conclusion. I do not offer this as absolute truth, only as a way of staying in relationship with mystery without forcing certainty. Perhaps spirituality is not about reaching a higher state. Perhaps it is about noticing where relationship has become distant or harmful and gently returning to presence, returning to connection, returning to repair, returning to the immediacy of being alive, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And if God is anything like this, if God is relationship, awareness, and the living unfolding of existence itself, then perhaps nothing has ever been separate from it, only sometimes in the forgetting, and always in some way still connected. I'm sharing my personal reflection, not as a framework that others have to subscribe to as dogma, not as absolute truth. I invite you instead to take what resonates and leave what doesn't, and join the conversation of how you experience these things for yourself. How do you experience being in relationship? What do you experience as God? And if you're curious about how to develop a relationship with yourself and your inner world that invites in curiosity and understanding and more compassion, that creates less suffering for yourself and others, I do invite you to read my book, The Divine Within, Healing Ourselves to Heal the World, or go to my website, blossomingheartwellness.com, to learn how to work with me as a therapy client or as a wellness coach or in spiritual mentorship. I'm sending you deep love and appreciation for who you are and for your unique ideas and way of experiencing the world.